From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. With workplace mental health becoming a safety prerogative, this is the source of information on psychological injury prevention and health promotion.
Hi, and welcome to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. My name is Jason Van Schie, and I'm one of the hosts of the show. The aim of the podcast is to rapidly increase the knowledge and application of psychological health and safety in workplaces worldwide. To help with this, we have regular guests from around the world who are leading the way in this important area. But before I introduce our guest and topic for today, allow me to introduce my co-host, Joelle Mitchell. How are you today, Joelle?
Episode 101.
Yeah. So we're actually recording this whilst we're recording episode 100, because we're actually having to do a few different recordings to get all of our guests for that one. But 101.
Dalmatians.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry.
So, is this a milestone that we need to celebrate as well? 101.
You don't let us celebrate milestones, Jason.
Letting you have your 100 celebration. So
letting me.
You're letting you. Yeah.
You listeners, we got to like 20,000, and Jason said, "No, we're not celebrating at 20. We can celebrate at 25." And then we got to 25 and we didn't celebrate. And now we've got past 40 and we're still not celebrating.
Yeah,
until we get to
50,000.
50, and then, all right, listeners, when we get to 50, I will let you know if Jason has decided we're allowed to celebrate.
Oh, you'll probably see it on LinkedIn, but we're only from this episode 101. We're probably only a few weeks out from hitting 50,000.
Yeah, we're less than. Well, what are we up to now? Almost 44. Yeah.
So we'll probably be there a few weeks after this goes to air, and then you can celebrate. Okay, Joelle?
I can celebrate.
All right. Well, I don't know. Might have a team celebration. We might even get Jack in on that.
Well, we could. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it would be okay because, Jack has been very helpful.
Yeah, he has. So, 101. No anecdotes from the life of Joelle today.
Not a lot to talk about, really. I'm recovering from a cold. I didn't catch COVID in Melbourne, so that was a unforeseen positive.
Yeah. Unforeseen negative.
No, it's an unforeseen positive.
Negative result.
I was expecting. Well, all right. Yes, I was expecting to catch it, and I didn't. So
yeah.
Hooray.
Okay. Well, no news is actually really good news for Joelle.
It is.
What a lovely, boring life you're leading.
Just now it is. Yeah.
Brilliant. You'll take that.
I will.
Nice. Well, look, let's introduce our guest in for today.
Yes.
This is actually the third appearance for this guest. She's come on as a solo guest before, as well as appeared on a live panel. She is currently Director, Workplace Health and Safety and Health Policy at the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Welcome back to the podcast, Jennifer Lowe.
Hi, Jason. Hi, Joelle. Thank you for having me again.
Yep. Anytime, Jen, if we could just do an episode a week with you, we'd be very happy with that.
I'm excited to be 101. I feel like that is a celebration. So well done.
Yep. So it is it's a big milestone. You were on number 17, I think it was, from memory.
Yeah, I don't know. I didn't write that one down.
Yeah. So you're one of our first guests because we were doing 3 a week crazily enough when we started.
Yeah.
So you would have been in our first month, and now you're episode 101. So really great to have you back on.
Keep up the pace.
So Jen, what podcasts are you listening to at the moment?
Oh, I did wonder about this question, and I did hope I'd had something different to last time, but the only one I've really added is the Huberman podcast, which is about neuroscience. So not that riveting, although some people would find it riveting, but no crime thrillers for me yet.
Yeah, no, neuroscience is it's something I think that really gets overhyped in terms of like practical application. So if there's somebody putting out information that's accurate and sort of myth busting, then I think that's probably pretty good to listen to. Cool. So what have you been up to since we last chatted with you?
Oh, well, a year has passed quickly. COVID, and then a bit of floods thrown in there with the East Coast floods at the start of the year. So everything emergency management still for me. And then, of course, the election. So that was probably the big change over the last couple of years. election campaigning, and then new government. So that's really been the summary of my last year.
Yep. So just responding to crises and change.
Yes, and a bit of BAU thrown in the mix. So obviously all of Safe Work Australia and other work health safety work, and of course what we're going to talk about today, the psychosocial developments.
Sounds like you need a holiday.
I do, and I am definitely planning one for the end of the year.
Good.
Yeah, there's a bunch of our team who have been working pretty hard lately, and we'll be taking some much deserved time off after we do a big deliverable in the next couple of weeks. So Jen, one of the reasons obviously we're talking to you today is we're following very closely, the changes in regulations coming out in Australia around psychosocial risks. And I guess to update or remind our listeners, in May of last year, the Australian ministers responsible for work health and safety agreed to amend our model workplace health and safety regulations to deal with psychosocial risks. So that was, over a year ago now. So what's happened in the past year in terms of this progress around these new regs?
Yeah, so regulation does move very slowly in Australia, and I guess that's one of the frustrations of a lot of the regulators in the jurisdictions, as well as obviously the stakeholders. So that agreement by the ministers did come out of the Boland Review, which was 2018. So yes, it has been a number of years now, and regs was certainly a focus, but we also had the code of practice thrown in there. So it's been a bit of a weird last year, because the code was actually agreed to first, and then the regulations were agreed to. And then since May last year, we've actually seen both of them being developed concurrently, which makes sense. Obviously, you don't want a code that's inconsistent with a new regulation. So they've been developed in sync, and both of them were probably finalised, I'd say, September, October last year. And then it's been a waiting process. So obviously drafting regulations does take some time, and then double checking all the phrasing and the nuances. So that's really been the last couple of months that we've been waiting for that process.
Yeah, and I guess one of the things that might have delayed it as well is that obviously it's an update to all of the regs on the back of the Boland Review, not just the psych health risks elements.
Yeah, so it was part of a package of amendments. So I can't... over 15 amendments, I'd say, off the top of my head. So yeah, it had to be done all at once, which also delayed the process further.
Yep. And so we've seen New South Wales, WA bring out codes of practice in relation to psychosocial risks in advance of the regs. So I'm assuming they were pretty close to the regs being developed when they developed their codes of practice, so they could make sure it was consistent.
One would hope that is the process being taken, but I'd say probably those codes were definitely finalised prior to the final debates on what would be in the model regulations. But because we are talking principles-based psych regulations, there shouldn't be too much, there isn't any inconsistency, given the codes are the practical guidance explaining the regulations. So at least we've avoided any problems there. But you've also got Queensland who are working on their own code of practice. So there are a few differences amongst the jurisdictions there.
Yeah, no, interesting.
So can you give our listeners an overview of the draft amendments as they relate to psychosocial risks? So maybe starting with the definitions. Yeah,
sure. So it was a really interesting process. In drafting the regulations, there were a group of us, so Safe Work Australia members, and then also the technical experts from the different jurisdictional regulators, plus the social partners, so union and employer reps. And we had several meetings really working through what was the minister's decision, how do you then apply it when you're drafting the regs. And one of the questions that came up was, should we have a definition or not? And that was pretty quickly agreed that yes, a definition would very much help clarify what this new area is, since it is, or can be, abstract for a lot of people and a lot of employers and stakeholders in particular. So we wanted to make sure we were on the same starting page. So the definition that we landed on, which I will read out so I get the wording correct. So in terms of psychosocial hazards is a hazard that arises from or relates to the design or management of work or a work environment or plant at a workplace or workplace interactions or behaviours, and that may cause psychological harm, whether or not it may also cause physical harm. So,
Sounds like a pretty classic definition from the regs.
Yeah, I wonder how many lawyers were involved in drafting that definition.
Love the
Yeah,
ors and the ands. Yeah.
the ands and the ors. But probably the really interesting element of that was there was a very lengthy debate as to whether stress should be referenced as the mechanism of harm or not. And that debate went on for several weeks. So some jurisdictions were very keen to be able to reference stress as a mechanism for harm. But then others argued that stress itself is a very tricky concept because obviously you can have good and bad stress. So then you would almost need to unpack stress and how stress works. And then it would be getting too complicated for a definition. So in the end, it was thought that instead we'd reference the fact that these particular elements may cause psychological harm. And then also there was a last minute addition of adding in the whether or not it may also cause physical harm.
Yeah, actually, I've got a quick question on that. So in relation to causing psychological harm, did you discuss what sort of harm we're talking about there? Is it just negative stress, or are we talking about the development of a mental illness or burnout or something like that?
So this is one of those ones where we will never know because it was agreed not to unpack that one further. So it'll be the common law interpretation of psychological harm. So same with, I guess it was designed to reflect what's in the definition against physical hazards or physical health. So it was trying to reflect that we don't unpack that and go, what is the meaning of physical harm? It was designed to reflect that level of interrogation.
Yeah, okay. So helpful and unhelpful.
Well, I mean, if you think about, there's just a whole mess if you try to do that, because then you're saying, well, we're only going to include things that are identified in the DSM, or do we go broader than that? And then, there's a lot of debate around, the DSM and the diagnostic criteria, and there are then different diagnostic criteria used by some disciplines and that sort of thing. So, it just opens up a whole can of worms without really any useful clarity, I think. So, I agree that it would be misaligned with sort of existing, they don't list every single possible adverse health outcome or injury that you can receive at work. So why would they do that for psychological health outcomes?
Yeah, no, fair enough.
Yeah. And then they've also thrown in a definition of meaning of psychosocial risk, which is, typical drafting of a psychosocial risk is a risk to the health or safety of a worker or other person arising from a psychosocial hazard. So that's, again, not really helpful, but kind of just echoes, again, what we see in that physical side and with the other regs.
So what do the amendments speak to as far as managing risk?
Yeah, so this is where it starts to get a little bit more interesting. So in terms of managing psychosocial risks, we started off with a discussion around what the ministers actually agreed to. So in the decision RIS, basically the ministers agreed to a principles-based drafting of a new regulation around psychosocial risk that didn't introduce new requirements. So it was meant to purely clarify the existing expectations. And So we went through and said, okay, well, what are the existing expectations under Section 19 and thinking of the interpretation of health as both physical and psychological health in the definition of the Act. And so that covered identification, eliminate so far as reasonably practicable, or minimise so far as reasonably practicable, maintain control measures and review control measures, which all form part of 3.1. And in most of the regs, the drafting refers to you must manage the risk. So where was I going with that? Oh, so I was getting to the fact that the hierarchy of control has been excluded, which was a pretty big decision to make. So in part 3.1, it goes through all of those elements, but it also refers to using the hierarchy of control, which I will remind listeners is one of many frameworks for risk management. And the argument was, and particularly from the employer's side, was that it's not necessarily the best fit for psychosocial risk, and to prescribe it when it's such a new area could potentially be detrimental because of this want to almost tick and flick. So give me a checklist of how I eliminate, substitute, engineer out, et cetera. And it would be very hard to teach everyone the fundamentals of this new area and then make sure that they're actually applying that framework correctly. And one of the key arguments we made was, well, already we could pick up differences in how the jurisdictions would use the hierarchy for different hazards. So if they could not even agree, and some of them were quite questionable as to whether they were an elimination control or not, given we're dealing with people and the interaction of people and workplaces, that was our main argument for not prescribing it. And the one that got over the line at the end was referring back to what the ministers agreed to, which was not to introduce new requirements. And it was seen that applying the hierarchy would be a new requirement to dealing with psychosocial risks, because you only prescribe the hierarchy to certain hazards in the regulation. So
yeah, okay. And I guess the Victorian regs, without calling it a hierarchy, sort of present a hierarchy, but it's a different hierarchy, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think the way the regulators have landed on it and in the guidance, so we go back to that fundamental of you must eliminate so far as reasonably practical, or if you can't, you minimise. So it's then in that minimise section what you look at doing. And then all of the guidance material can help stakeholders break that down further. So some jurisdictions might have a pseudo hierarchy of control framework that they use to help explain how you might minimise those risks, but we didn't want to just pick up the existing hierarchy and plop it in.
Yeah, no, I agree. It doesn't really track across very well at all.
Over in Victoria, they're talking about, eliminate and then job redesign preferably. And then if all else fails, administration, so training and policy, and then self-care last. So that's a nice hierarchy, I think, that kind of fits in. And WorkSafe Victoria have been very vocal about administration and self-care should be seen as a last resort or a supplementary control. We should be seeking to eliminate and job redesign first.
Well, they've actually said that admin controls can't be used on their own. They can only be used sort of to enhance job design controls. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's probably leading nicely into the last element of the regs, which is around the control measures. And this one was, again, interesting. At first, there was a bit of a debate as to do we prescribe certain hazards in the regs, but then that was dangerous territory because obviously it's still an emerging area and there's ongoing research. So you could imagine having to add more hazards, and then do you list all of them or do you just choose the common? So that was quickly a no-go. And that's something, again, that will be covered in codes or guidance. And then it was looking at the manual handling section of the regs and how they do it, because how they're different is they actually list relevant factors to take into consideration when controlling risks. And so that was seen as another method to highlight certain things that the regulators in particular thought stakeholders really needed to pay attention to, like design of work or systems of work. So in the regs, it actually goes through and lists, I think 8 or 9 different factors that have to be controlled. So if I quickly run through it, you've got the duration, frequency and severity of the exposure, how the psychosocial hazards may interact or combine, the design of work, the systems of work, the design and layout and environmental conditions, and then a separate one repeating that, but specifically focusing on workers' accommodation, the plant, substances and structures, workplace interactions or behaviours, and then information, training, instruction and supervision.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so it is sort of covering then that full spectrum of work. Quite a lot of that sounds like they might have been listening to us, Jason.
Yeah, well, we like the manual handling and the noise exposure analogies.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, the frequency, duration, and severity of exposure. That's
something
we like that. Yep, we talk about that a lot.
Like that. Well, let's get into it.
Yeah, and the combination. So if we think about an exposure assessment from a hygiene perspective, right, to understand risk, you need to understand those 3 factors, right? You can't just take, if we use the noise analogy, you can't just take the severity of noise as one kind of measure. We also need to understand the frequency and duration of exposure to understand the risk of hearing damage. So, I think there's actually some good similarities you can pull for psychosocial hazard exposure. Sometimes severity is enough, like, being exposed to occupational violence, for example, a high severity incident could be enough to actually contribute to a psychological injury. But often it's like those ones that are pervasive and ongoing, like work demands, which is maybe mild severity, but it's just ongoing and all the time.
Well, incivility is a good one for that.
That's another good one too.
It might be, it's not severe, but it's just constant. And it just, gradually erodes away at you.
Yeah. So, we can have it out if you want, Jen. But we quite like it. Yeah.
I guess it is a really interesting 2 in particular, because they're the 2 that we fought to have removed from the reg. As an employer representative, I was very concerned that they are quite abstract concepts. And yes, theoretically, they make perfect sense. And with my psych hat on, I'm all aboard. But with an employer rep hat on, I go, please explain how the average small business owner would do this. And as yet, there is not great guidance from any of the regulators, or even from what I can see, a initial go at how you would explain doing this to the average employer.
And that's the problem, right? With the regulator-sponsored tools, they don't assess severity, frequency, duration of hazard exposure. But there may just be a freely available tool.
There might be. If you have fewer than 12 employees.
It's available for free.
Oh, you have a tool? That would
And the next step is step 2 of what you're talking about there, not just considering the risk of hazard exposure to each isolated hazard on its own, but looking at the combination of hazard exposures and how that contributes to total psychological injury risk. So we're on top of it, Jen. It's good to see the regulations are finally catching up with us.
Yeah, and if the regulators want to have a chat to us about,
improving their practice and improving, organisations in their different states. Yeah,
here we are.
That's great, because the employers are going to need as much help as possible. I guess it's the difference with noise is you do have more objective measures. So it's how do you apply some sort of more objective measure of this to something that is so subjective?
Then that's the challenge. And I guess that because it's, everybody responds to psychosocial hazards in different ways. And so that's really why, our view is that you need to be able to consult both at breadth and at depth across your workforce. You can't just sort of get a group of people together to comment on it, because you're not going to be capturing the full gamut of experience there. So that's really where the technology side of it comes into it, and can be a really powerful help for organizations.
But also the nuanced way of, rather than asking people to rate their workload, for example, and getting back a result of it's low, average, or high for this percentage of your population, and then assuming risk, actually asking people to what degree has work overload, for instance, caused you to feel stressed in the past few months. Because we all know, Jen, like you'd be in a crumpled heap if workload was a stressor for you.
No. But no, I think that's helpful. And the more we can unpack this, and perhaps another podcast purely focused on those two would be very helpful for a lot of your listeners. Because I know I've got questions from my employers as to, well, how would you remotely do that for organizational justice, which is already, again, such an abstract but also subjective topic. So how do you measure duration, frequency, and severity of injustice in the organisation? So it's things like that I think employers are going to grapple with when they first see the regulations. And then it'll be a matter of, well, here's the additional guidance, and where there isn't, really putting pressure on the regulators, but also others to innovate to fill that gap.
Yeah, well, we'll give you a link to a previous podcast that we did a few months ago where we talked to this.
Yeah, we could maybe do another expert series where we actually speak specifically to the regs and talk about how.
Yeah, we might even need to do another panel with Jenny and then Carlo on it or something like that.
There was that one. Probably the other one that I'll just flag that raised some eyebrows was the substances and structures part. So again, that was one that we weren't too sure fit in the regulations. Yes, plant makes sense, or equipment or working environment, but to specifically highlight substances and structures, that can also be a bit of a leap for some people to go, okay, well, how would working with substances be a psychosocial risk? So I think it's more being able to connect the dots for people again, and explain, if I'm working with acid, I don't really want to burn my hands off. So that's going to create some stress. So then, and really explaining it in everyday terms.
Yeah, I mean, thinking just about, the relatively recent news stories about like lung diseases in like stone workers and that sort of thing. So you can, when you, I think, start to use those types of examples, it becomes a lot clearer that, if they know that they're, at a high risk of actually developing these sort of terminal illnesses as a result of exposure to these substances, and they don't feel like they've got adequate PPE, it's going to be a big stressor for them.
Yeah, I mean, even COVID is a very current example, right? There was people, and probably still is, people fearful of going back to the office. And so that's where plant like ventilation becomes important. Exposure to the virus itself is a stressor for people.
Yeah, and as I explained to my members, a lot of the time you might not actually need to do anything new. You might already have good controls in place, but it's how well you're communicating that to the workers. So that communication aspect, again, is critical in terms of reducing that psychosocial risk in particular.
Well, actually, this is actually a pretty good segue. We're talking about some of the difficulties in understanding certain terms in relation to psychosocial risk. So what other guidance material do you think needs to maybe support these incoming regs?
Yeah, so we have, and I mean Safe Work Australia, as the membership board, so all of the jurisdictions and social partners have talked about developing a framework of guidance materials. So really recognising that there are so many new terms and so many new concepts that need to be unpacked. And there needs to be a process to do that. That makes sense. So if you look at what we already have, we have the Act, we now have the regs, we have a model code as well, which is on its way. We did have a guide. So there was a national guide, but that is likely to be withdrawn because already concepts in that guide are somewhat outdated or potentially inconsistent with the code. So I guess that does highlight just how quickly this area does evolve and what we consider the best controls or the best way to communicate certain hazards. So by removing that guide, then we open up to a suite of guidance that can hone in on specific areas in the code. So again, that kind of tiered, let's unpack things as we go down. And we already have the workplace bullying guide, the sexual harassment guide, the fatigue guide. However, that is very old and needs a substantial overhaul. So that is listed for a review. And then we're also working on a working from home guide. So that should also be out shortly given COVID. And again, it's unfortunate that these documents take so long to develop. That's been almost a year, I think, that's been in development. But, you know, if it is regulation or even at guidance level, you do want to make sure it's drafted correctly because that can be used as state of knowledge for court cases or prosecutions. So as an employer rep, I want to make sure there's nothing in it that could get employers into trouble or that is ambiguous. So.
Yeah, it makes sense. So the Safe Work Australia guide for psychosocial risk management was that 2018?
Yeah, around 17, 18.
Yeah, so like you said, it's not that old, but already maybe a little bit out of date with current thinking in this space. I remember the working hours one because I was doing a bit of work in fatigue risk management at the time. So WA was the first to bring out a code on working hours. I think that was 2006. I think was it 2011? I think the Safe Work Australia one. So that's over 10 years old as well.
So yeah. So that's definitely up for review. And then we're also looking at, do we break down guidance by industry? So that is something that ACCI's pushed. When we did the Boland review, there was a big discussion around, do group guidance by hazards or by industry? And most of the employers that we talked to said, actually, you know, if I'm in healthcare, it would be really good to group all of the relevant hazards to healthcare in one guide. So we're looking at doing this for psychosocial hazards, where if you're in health or if you're in construction, these are the most common psychosocial hazards, and then explaining that in the context of that industry.
WorkSafe Victoria actually did a really good publication around school education, so high school, primary school, and talked to the two main health and safety risks, which were manual handling and psychosocial. And so that actually gave some really good relevant industry examples of that. So I think industry specific is actually really useful and probably most easy to be applied.
As long as they include small business.
Yeah, that's always the issue with that kind of guidance, isn't it? It tends to be targeting sort of enterprise and large organizations, and doesn't really think about practicability for a small business.
Yeah, particularly when they start talking about suites of policies and procedures, it's, well, you know, your average small business probably doesn't have a handbook of policies or procedures, or have different ways of operating and more one-on-one with staff. So yeah, I think that's probably going to be the challenge. How do you provide guidance that's relevant to all of the different types of small businesses in particular?
Yeah, as a small business ourselves, that's something that we should be thinking about, Jason.
Sure.
Another project for you. There you go.
That sounds like a Dan project to me.
Yeah. Dan's on holidays. We can throw him under the bus as much as we like.
We can. Yeah. He'll be really pleased to come back and have that to do. So, Jen, what feedback have you received so far from industry in response to the draft?
Mainly who's going to implement it and when, along with kind of some concerns, like I said, about elements, the duration frequency elements, how you do it in practice. There has been some conflicting messages from jurisdictional regulators. So when my employer reps in different jurisdictions have gone to presentations by the regulator, there are some inconsistencies, I guess, in the presentations to what's been discussed at the national level. And that is the wonderful federated model that we have. Even though we want to be as consistent and harmonised as possible, everyone does seem to go a slightly different way and want to apply their own context to everything. So I think that's going to be the number one challenge is, yes, Safe Work Australia has published these model draft regulations and will soon publish the model code, but to what extent is that consistent across every jurisdiction? And as an employer who might work across jurisdictions, or generally as an employer, which one's better? Which piece of guidance do I look at, and what happens if there's actually conflicting advice in the different pieces of guidance? So that's probably the main challenge and the main kind of theme of the questions that I'm getting at the moment.
Yeah, and so that will be obviously for employers who are sort of working across jurisdictions. So what I mean, that's something that they have to deal with anyway, with other codes and other aspects of legislation. So how do they typically deal with that?
Yeah, so it's probably not as pronounced in other areas as what we're seeing here. I think the reason for that is there was this big push in 2018-19 for greater focus on psychosocial risks and hazards. And yeah, so each jurisdiction's kind of powered ahead and gone, well, we're not going to wait for this national process because we know it takes a lot of time. So we're going to work on our own materials. And you actually do see in the codes, some jurisdictions have a different list of common hazards. So that's probably where it's most pronounced. We do have different hazards. Then if you're an employer who, even if I'm in WA, for instance, if I grab the New South Wales code, you would expect if it's a regulated document, that advice should stand. So yeah, that's probably a confusing element.
Yeah. I mean, we've sort of had that question a couple of times from clients who do work across jurisdictions, and just, thinking with my ex-regulator hat on, I wouldn't necessarily be looking at, well, have you assessed every one of the hazards that we've listed in our code of practice, because they are there as examples. They're not, it's not a prescriptive document. And what I would be looking more for is, do you have a system of work that actually helps you to identify the hazards that are relevant to your workforce and understand the risk associated with them, and then put, controls in place? So it's more about, do you actually have evidence that your safety management system is doing what it is supposed to do in relation to psychosocial risk?
Yeah. And my advice to employers would probably be, have a look at all the different guidance, because it might make more sense to you how one code is phrased to another. So yeah, whatever makes sense to you that allows you to actually implement, the identify, assess, control measures, that's probably the best advice.
Yeah, and ultimately the code of practice is there to show I guess the minimum expectation, but as long as you can demonstrate that what you're doing is equal to or better than what that code delivers, then that's really sort of what the legal standing of the code of practice provides.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah. So within that, then, how likely do you think it is that the states and territories will adopt the amended regs?
Yeah, so with the regs, given all of the jurisdictions are now under the model work health safety framework except Victoria, I would expect all of them to adopt the regulations. The question will be timing. So WA, for instance, has obviously just introduced the new work health safety legislation. So I am not sure what the appetite would be to then immediately introduce another amendment to the regulations when they're trying to embed understanding of the new general framework of the Act and regs. So I guess that is probably the number one question, how it's rolled out and the timing. Victoria is obviously working on their own regulations. How consistent that will be with the model regulations is still to be determined. I hope it is consistent, and I hope they do try and match up particularly definitions or key elements, because that would just be even more complicated for employers. But yeah, so the regs is probably more straightforward. The code of practice is where you'll see the most differences. And because I explained previously, a lot of the jurisdictions did kind of get ahead of the model process. So New South Wales have theirs, WA's published theirs, and a FIFO code in WA. Queensland's already developed their own code, although soon to publish. And Victoria and ACT were talking about a potential code. They might now move to adopt the model one, but again, that's a bit up in the air.
So I guess in terms of the states kind of thinking about this, are there any other things that we should be following in terms of next steps for these amendments?
Yeah, so now that we've seen the drafting, so it's probably keeping an eye on Safe Work Australia's website, jurisdictional websites for announcements that the regs have been passed by the relevant parliaments and jurisdictions, and the code of practice has to be approved by the ministers in the jurisdiction. So a slightly different process of approval there. But in terms of what else, I guess it's then that suite of guidance, and Safe Work Australia is planning a rather big comms campaign, because obviously this is such a new concept. You want to make sure it is communicated widely and in a controlled manner in terms of explaining where everything fits together. So that's quite good. And probably external to that, you've also got obviously the standard, the ISO standard sitting there in the background, which is a little bit different to the regs in terms of it is broader. So it is, again, that more holistic systems approach. So it's complementary to it. And then you also have the work of the Mentally Healthy Workplace Alliance, which I think I touched on last time, which is this kind of one-stop shop portal, which will also cover legislation developments and codes of practice and regulations. So they're probably the three that I'd keep an eye on. There's other things happening, vocational space, so training, universities trying to keep up with how do we now introduce this concept, how do we develop training on it, and then things like the Book of Knowledge, tackling a new chapter. So yeah, quite a lot of movement in this space, but I guess it's a good thing.
Yeah, it's good that universities are thinking about it from a curriculum perspective, and it'll be interesting to see whether that's enhancing curriculums of existing qualifications, or if it's actually creating a new qualification. I guess there's pros and cons to both of those things, and maybe it's both.
Yeah, and I'd see it as a really good crossover unit. So if you're a HR student or OSH or even a lawyer, like that would be a good unit that any of those kind of disciplines could and should be able to pick up. But I guess we'll wait and see.
And organizational psychology.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, now there is some talk about micro-credentials in this space. The only one accredited course that we're aware of is from the Canadian Mental Health Commission on psychosocial risk management, I think it is.
It's I think a psychosocial safety advisor, maybe.
Yeah, that's the
something
one.
like that. Yeah.
I'll have to look into that one.
All right. Well, Jen, that's been a really good unpacking. Is there anything else that our listeners should know about the regs?
Probably not on the regs. I'd just say, again, this is a shifting, emerging space. So there is so much funding going into new research, particularly around good controls and good intervention strategies at a organizational level. So that's probably the area that we'll see a lot of new work and developments coming out of in the next couple of years. So yeah, keep an eye on that.
Yeah, it's definitely a missing piece that we hope to contribute to as well. I think it's pretty well understood now, the different by a number of people, the common psychosocial hazards and their impact on psychological health of employees is pretty well understood. But what's not so well understood are what are the, in particular, systemic controls that can be put in place to protect employees from harm. Yeah, great. Well, Jen, we asked you this last time you were on, or when you were on as a solo guest, so the first episode that you're on. I can't recall for the life of me what you said at the time. I'd have to go back to re-listen to that episode.
Shame on you, Jason, for not remembering everything that our guests say.
And
Jason,
I never do.
Jason, letting me
down. I'm horrible at homework too. So didn't do any homework before this. So Jen, if you were to think into the future, what would your hopes for the future of workplace mental health be?
I think at this point, it would be that everyone has that basic understanding, but also a basic understanding of what is one or two things they can do to improve it in workplaces and in their general lives. So I think that's the goal for me. I don't think everyone's going to be, a org psych on it, but if we can teach people to be more critical about, okay, I'm aware that there is this psychosocial problem, whatever that means, but this is what we could do to address it in the workplace and actually take that methodical approach. I think that that's probably the best outcome in the next, 2 to 5 years.
Yeah, I dare say this is probably, you've probably toned down your hopes in the last year. Maybe just become more cynical every year. I don't know. But
do you want to call it cynical or do you want to call it pragmatic?
Yeah, either or. So yeah, I have spoken to companies about that as well, about, hey, you don't have to become a mentally healthy organization overnight, or you don't go from where you currently are to the best practice overnight. It's continuous improvement, right?
Yeah.
So just those incremental improvements over time. And then hopefully, you just get better and better in this space and, do better and better for the well-being of your employees.
Yeah, and genuine improvements. So not, the old school tick and flick or here, have some time off, go to a yoga class, like genuine assessment of what could actually work.
Yeah. And if COVID's taught us anything, really large scale, rapid transformation of how we work is possible with enough, impetus. So if you can see the fail of your business, unless you make a change, then you're going to change, right? And you're going to start learning how to work remotely, for instance.
Yeah.
But companies, they often say, well, this is a systemic issue, really big. We can't possibly change this. But then I guess, if it was business critical, then they'd actually come up with some solutions, I reckon.
And I think that's where you guys are probably leading the way in your use of data and analytics. Like, to me, definitely in the last 6 months, that is something I think will be the focus for the next kind of year or two, is that AI, data, analytics, technology, and then applying it to this psychosocial space. So how do we get better at using it, given we've had to shift so quickly over COVID to embracing technology? So you guys are well positioned there. Yeah.
No, it's an interesting space, and we hope to make some announcements actually in upcoming podcasts about what we're doing in this space to really rapidly, make an impact in the data intelligence space in particular. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, Jen, words of advice for our listeners who want to do more in this space.
Read as much as you can. I'd say that we're at that point in time where there is a lot of information coming out, and not to just probably look at one source, but to spend as much time as you can to reviewing different sources of information.
With a critical thinking hat on.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, nice. Because yes, there is a lot of content out there at the moment.
And a reasonable percentage of it is nonsense.
Yeah. Jen, it's been amazing having you on again. Let's not leave it a year before the next episode that we do with you. Obviously, like you say, it's if anything, it's just becoming more rapid, the transformation and developments we're seeing in this psychosocial space. So I think there's probably a good argument to have you on again in about 6 months to give us an update about where the world's at again.
Yeah, how are the states progressing? How are the companies responding?
Yep. And are the codes published yet?
Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
Crossed. Yeah.
But yeah, no, thank you again so much for your time, Jen. We look forward to having you on again at some time in the near future.
No, thank you, Jason. Thank you, Joelle. It was lovely.
Great, listeners. Well, that brings us to the end of another excellent episode with an amazing guest. Remember, we do video these things when we record with our guests. So if you prefer to take on a video medium rather than the podcast, it's probably too late for this episode, but you can go check it out on the Flourish DX YouTube page. We'll also be publishing some of the clips, highlights from this conversation with Jen on our Flourish DX LinkedIn page, as we do with all of our podcasts. So feel free to check out some of the highlights over there. And then while you're over on LinkedIn, make sure you connect with Joelle and myself if you want to continue the conversation on that medium. But that's it, listeners. We'll catch you next episode.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. To stay up to date with the latest on psychological injury prevention, follow Flourish DX on LinkedIn and subscribe to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast at www.psychealthandsafety.com.